the map itself wasn't meant to be a map of Lake Superior. That would be pointless. Okay, just a big body of water. What it was meant to do was to illustrate the villages, native villages that are, quote, dependent on the LaPointe villages right here. Okay, so it was meant to demonstrate where the other people lived and other features and things like that. It wasn't meant to be a map of Lake Superior. What do we know about this map for sure? We know that these early Jesuit maps are pretty good as far as latitude wise go. This one here is just like Marquette's map. This one here are about a half a degree off, which is still pretty good considering that these guys were out with a quadrant, a compass, counting paddle strokes and such in a birch bark canoe. But it's really off as far as east and west goes because they didn't have, they knew about longitude, but longitude requires mathematics. Longitude requires a proper timepiece, and they didn't have it yet. So they're going to be a little bit off as far as east and west goes. But all in all, it's a pretty darn good map. So good that Franquelin and Jolliet would copy that map for Joliet's or the Franquelin 1674 La Colberti map. The map illustrates the route of Marquette and Joliet's voyage. Okay, it includes the location of Indian villages, features such as rivers, lakes, and rapids. And it was, once again, it was part of his annual report. It wasn't just a map drawn because he didn't have anything to do and he started to draw a map. Okay. Now, the cool thing about Marquette's map and report is that they complement each other. Things that Marquette didn't write on the map, the text of his report covers. Okay, they explain each other, they work off each other, as opposed to LaSalle's map in 1684 when LaSalle went to Canada or went to France with Jean-Baptiste Franquelin to get an extension on his Western enterprise. LaSalle's map that was drawn in 1684 by Franquelin and his correspondences to his supporters, friends, and governmental reports, these things are completely off and completely irreconcilable. So with LaSalle, you don't know which side is right, which is the map right, you know, if the map's right. He said in his correspondences that the Peorias were living here near Starved Rock, but his map shows them living somewhere in Iowa. So they're completely irreconcilable. Marquette's map and report complement each other. So let's look at a few places in the map. One of them was the Menominee village, the wild rice or wild grain people that they met. It was probably the first group that they met. Joliet and Marquette spent the winter of 1672 and 1673 gathering as much information as they possibly could about the future voyage, trying to talk to the Indians. What do you guys know about this? How about this? What do we need to know? And so Marquette actually drew some kind of rough map about it. So on May 17th, 1673, they left the St. Ignace mission, paddled out into Lake Michigan, paddled under the Mackinac Bridge, and made it along the coastline of the UP. And in between the Escarpment Islands there, they entered Green Bay and got to the Menominee River. Now, this was normal to go reconnoitering up the Menominee River. The Menominee village probably wouldn't have been right on the shoreline because of the winds, the winter winds and waves and things like this. It was probably a short distance up. So either Marquette knew about it or they went up exploring and saw it. These people had met Allouez, they met Dablon, they met Father Andre prior to 1673, and they knew some of the French traders, guys like Nicolas Perrault and other guys, other Coureurs de Bois. Marquette told them that he was going to distant nations to teach them the mystery of his faith. So the Menominee says, you know what, you're going to run into hostile warriors, navigational hazards, whirlpools, river monsters, and a giant demon who's going to block their path. And even if they survive that, the summer heat would surely kill them. Well, the Menominee want to be able to keep the French and the trade goods to themselves, which gives themselves a little bit of position of power over more distant tribes. But Marquette and Joliet basically told them, yeah, we're good. We have faith that we will make it. Okay. But what's interesting and why I bring this village up is because we call them the Menominee wild rights people or wild oats people. And in Marquette's report, there's a couple of paragraphs dedicated just to the harvesting of wild rice. One thing you have to learn from these reports is that not all the reports were written by the people who wrote them. These were edited in Quebec. For example, Marquette's report for 1673 was edited by Claude de Blonde, who was the Jesuit superior of Canada. And he would have to write an introduction to it. So the first couple of paragraphs are going to be, in this year, Father Marquette and Louis Jolliet went on this voyage and did these things and such. So they always start with that. They also edit things. They will add things, and I'm sure they probably took things out. The reason why I bring this up is because Marquette was at the Menominee village in the spring, in May. They harvest wild rice in September and October. But who was there in September and October at this village? Claude de Blonde. So it seems more likely than not, because there's so much time dedicated to this wild rice, that de Blonde probably added that little bit. As we will see, he probably added other sections to Marquette's report. They made it to the mouth of the Fox River at Green Bay, and they passed the St. Xavier Mission at the first set of rapids right here in Wisconsin's Fox River. There probably was nobody there at the time. The mission itself was not a mission site per se, like other mission sites. Other mission sites would generally have a chapel, a church, and the Jesuit would live there for 6 or 8 months a year. And it was the center of their ministry. This place here was more like a home base, where after they left the missions with the Potawatomi, left the missions with the Menominee, left the missions with the Meskwaki, they would come here to St. Xavier's, probably to rest and relax and take a break from all their struggles. So there was nobody there. Matter of fact, Marquette didn't even mention it. So it must have been small, diminutive, and there was nobody there anyway. But we know he had to pass it, okay? We know that Father Andre was away with the Potawatomi at the time, and Eloise was among the Meskwaki on the Wolf River, Wisconsin's Wolf River, okay? And Marquette had never been that far west before, or southwest before. This is the first time. He's in uncharted waters for him and Joliet personally. The next place they stopped is, for some reason, history calls this place the Mascoutin Village. It's right near Berlin, Wisconsin, and this is the site right here, okay? It's archaeologists call the site the Springview site, 47 GL 132, or 47 Green Lake County 132. And it was at that site a few years earlier that Marquette founded the Mission of St. Jacques. It was a multi-tribal village. There was not only Mascoutin, so anytime you can find a Mascoutin, you're going to find Meskwaki or Fox. You're also going to find Kickapoo, which we know the Kickapoo there. There was also Illinois living there. There was also Miami living there. And it was a trading village as well, because we know Nicholas Perot and surely some of the Coureurs de Bois, they got in a tangle with some of the Meskwaki or Fox had in that area, were probably there too. But it was a hiding place. It was more of it became a refugee camp by 1675-ish or so. This is where Alleyways was hanging out in Wisconsin while LaSalle was in the Illinois country. And we know it was a hiding place because of its location. It's not on the Fox River. It's a mile or two away from the Fox River, up on a bluff, okay? As far as the refugee camp goes too, de Blonde, who is great at exaggerating numbers, said that there would be as many as 20,000 people living here at the site, which is that's a pretty good one. Another important thing about this village is because we had reached Joliet's linguistic limit, okay? He and Marquette both spoke to the tribes here, but after this point, Joliet, you never hear from him again speaking to the tribe. No, Joliet knew Ojibwa, Adawa, likely, and Montagnais, but these tribes can understand that too. But by the time they got here, this was the end of it, okay? And so they asked for Miami guides, or some guides, and they were given a couple of Miamis to escort them to the Wisconsin portage. Okay? And you can see here, this is the Mascoutin Village right here off Marquette's map, and you can see it's away from the river, located on a big hill. As a matter of fact, many of these places were hiding spots, refugee camps, and defensive sites during times of warfare, not located right on the river where they can get you. Sometimes Native Americans would make villages on islands, because I used to say when I used to give tours out at Star of Rock, as Native Americans at that time did not have life insurance. So if dad was killed, family might be in some desperate trouble. So they sold their lives dearly. And they did not like to expose themselves going to some place. So these villages were either on islands or some inaccessible place like this place was, okay? But you must have a local water source. As I said, if the world ever comes to an end, my first thing I wish I could have was a source of water. I can live without electricity, but I cannot live without water. Now, this is a picture of that site back in 1906, and you can see this is a big spring. And see, it has to be a spring because it's up on top of the hill. There obviously wouldn't be, they couldn't, it was too much of a chore to get water from a mile or two away just to bring back up on the top of the hill. And this was probably dug out by the Native Americans, because there were thousands of Native Americans living on the site. So you had a nice big spring here that was probably dug out to make it more viable. And another reason why they would want guides is this is the picture of the Upper Fox River. Okay. It is wide, it's shallow, there's grassy islands. The French have never been, these French have never been this far before. And they may be on the backside of this island over here, but the portage is over here. And at portage would have been very, very difficult to see if you didn't know where you're at. So this is why they would have guides. The next place of importance they stopped was this one here, Pewa-Awewa. You've heard that word before. We call them the Peoria. Okay, that's what the Peoria call themselves. They visited two villages near the confluence of the Des Moines River and the Mississippi River. Even though it's not specifically pointed out in Marquette's report, it appears to me that they reconnoitered a little ways up the Des Moines River, and they entered this village site here from the Des Moines. This here is only about a mile from the Des Moines River, whereas it's at least 5 miles from the Mississippi. And since this was probably a hiding spot, not necessarily a refugee village, because this village were located west of the Mississippi in today's Missouri, because that was way, way, way far from the, or at least at the limit of where the Iroquois could strike. Okay. Marquette mentions these two villages right here as the Pewa-Awewa, or belonging to the Peoria. And they are known as today, as archaeologists label them, the Haas and Hagerman sites, 23 Clark from Clark County, Missouri, 116. Roughly, according to Marquette, 6,000 people were living at the sites. So there was not 6,000 Peorias, there never were. And so this had to include other groups, not the Kaskaskia, because we know they're going to encounter the Kaskaskia, but probably any number, Moanguinas and Tamaroas, Cahokias, and other groups and such, okay? And this village here, or these two villages here, which are right next to each other, were probably the villages that the Illinois at La Pointe up by Ashland, Wisconsin, at the St. Esprit Mission, told them where they lived, because Allouez said that at one time, he wrote that at one time there were 10 Illinois villages, now they're down to 2, and those villages are in such and such a location. These are those 2 villages. Okay. Marquette wrote about his and Joliet's experience there, about Illinois customs, calumets, and things like that. More importantly, they were given an Indian boy, little boy, and we'll discuss him later. Another thing that's important is they spent 1 night at the site. Okay, just 1 night, and that'll come up too, coming up. The villages also had, just like the villages over there in Berlin, Wisconsin, had a good source of water. And here is one of them. This is a big, deep oxbow lake that's a mile or so from the Des Moines River and about at least 5 miles from the Mississippi River, an inland lake where 6,000 people had water, good water supply. They had 2 scrapes as they went farther south, the Monsapalea and with the Michigamia. Okay, but they come out unscathed. Both the Indians and the French mistook each other's intentions, and but it ended up okay for both groups. What's really interesting is that the Michigammia, they were a Siouan speaking group. They weren't an Illinois group. They merged with the Illinois by the late 1800s and bolstered their numbers because the Illinois population was dwindling very, very rapidly. And without the Michigamme, there would have been a lot fewer. Okay. So they arrived at the Arkansas village, which is at the terminus of their voyage going south. Jolliet, being the trader, is no doubt checking all these villages they stop out, the ability of trade goods. And they found here at the Arkansas village that there weren't many. As a matter of fact, all the other villages that they passed or visited all had bison hides. I mean, they were common. Okay. But here, I believe they only saw a bison hide, and they were reduced to eating fruits and vegetables and things like this. And it was because the enemy tribes prevent trade with the Spanish, or the Spanish, as I have there. So completing their objectives, realizing that, you know what, these people are telling the truth, obviously, because there are no trade goods. They're very humble and things like this. We think since we've completed our objectives, let's get the heck back out of here with what we have. And they probably had boxes and bags full of specimens of ore and birds they killed or whatever. So they collected a lot of stuff, and they said, let's get out of here. Okay. So I believe it's August 25th, they arrived right here. This is where the Illinois River empties into the Mississippi River. Okay. How did they know? How do we know it was August 25th? Marquette's report doesn't say that. Oh, that's correct. It didn't. However, we know that Catholic missionaries oftentimes named places for the feast date that they first arrived at those places. For example, Father Hennepin named Lake St. Clair because it was when he was on LaSalle ship. The day that they entered the feast day of St. Clair was whatever day, and so the lake got its name. There was St. Jacques and St. Xavier's and St. Mark's and all those missions founded by Allouez that were founded because he was there on the day of that feast. The Illinois River was first known to the French as the River St. Louis. The feast day of St. Louis, Louis IX, was August 25th, right about when they would have arrived there. And they would have had a heck of a paddle because on the way down the Mississippi River, Marquette noted that there was streams and whole islands and stuff coming out, being belched out of the Missouri River and into the Mississippi. Well, they had to paddle. It took them about 41 days to get from that Arkansas village to the Illinois village. And there's all kinds of rivers that dump into the Mississippi. That's one of the reasons they had that little Indian boy who was a guide. Okay. The next place that they landed was at this place, Kaskaskia. The French call it Kaskaskia in LaSalle County, Illinois, just a few miles from my house right here. 11 LaSalle County, 13. The cool thing is one of the things we bring around in the book is the Kaskaskis were surely expecting the French groups. And that's if they survived the river monsters and whirlpools and things like that, and the snakes and such. These groups, the Illinois groups, as at this time was probably about 10, 12, 14 different sub-tribes, subgroups. They had constant communication with each other. They weren't living in their own universe. They knew when it was time when young Illinois boys go out to meet young Illinois girls. They knew when there was times of feasts. They knew when the summer buffalo hunt was going to be held. They knew when they might have heard a rumor that the Iroquois are going to attack. So they have to get together and form some kind of strategy to deal with it. And so they surely knew that the French were coming here too, because this was big news to these folks, okay? Marquette recorded that there was about 74 cabins at the site, just Kaskaskia sub-tribe only. That translates to roughly about 1,480 people, give or take 100 or two. But what's important about this site is that that village is the reason for the French presence in this part of the United States, okay? This is what brought the French to the Illinois Valley, okay? And ultimately, that was the step to get to the Mississippi, which is the ultimate step to get them to the Gulf of Mexico. One of the reasons was for conversion of the tribes. Okay, big deal. They're going to talk about Jesus and baptize a few people. That's really nice. But that's not why conversion was so important. It was so important, and this goes all the way back to Jean Talon, who was the intendant of New France at the time, is because they were having a really hard time getting Frenchmen to move to Canada from France, between naval blockades and not wanting to have to deal with the Iroquois, and spend 10 years chopping down trees before you can plant your first wheat and things like that, and dealing with the cold temperatures. What Talon was hoping to do was to convert the tribesmen and eventually turn them into Frenchmen. So that's why the role of the Jesuits came from, that's really cool and good, I'm glad you're busy doing that, to very, very important. And that's why, that's one of the reasons for this village. And by time of LaSalle, if you can trust LaSalle's numbers, and that's a big if, there would have been as many as 9,000 people living in that village. It was also a place for trade too, because LaSalle had to trade in order to fund his expedition, but he was restricted to bison hides only in trade. And these people who lived here were bison hunters. Okay, they also got guides going to Lake Michigan, took them to Lake Michigan. And now let's talk about a couple of features. Okay, at the Wisconsin Portage, just before they got to the Wisconsin Portage, they were paddling up the Upper Fox. The crew stopped somewhere, I believe it was on an island, to pick an antidote for snake bite. This plant here, of which we would call snake root. Well, that's nice, but why did they do that? Because if you leave, and this is one of the ways I was able to reconstruct their voyage, is going back to people who had traveled that same route for the next 100 years and left very good memoirs on it. Later travelers reported that the brush along the Wisconsin Portage between the Fox River and the Wisconsin River was just full of rattlesnakes. So it's probable that they picked this stuff knowing that they're going to have to contend with these rattlesnakes. And here's another thing. This is when I do my writings, when I do my research, I try to go to every one of these places and do whatever I can do to reenact or find out about the site. Marquette recorded it was 2,700 steps, the portage between the Fox and Wisconsin rivers. So myself and my wife, man, I got to give her credit. She kind of like drove along the road with me. I counted 3,280 steps. So I was later to find out that the real portage was a little ways south, a couple hundred yards south of it. And the minute accuracy of the portage on the map is really something. This is Marquette's map, and this here is a later map. So this guy really knew his stuff. Okay. They also encountered Mississippi Rapids, and this is what's cool. I got to learn this from Michael McCafferty. And we'll see that as they were going down the Mississippi River, and this is one of the things he points out. You see the little dots right there? Those are islands. There's islands all the way down the Mississippi River. But then if you look closely, you'll see here, and you'll see here, and you'll see here lines. The lines are rapids. Okay, so even though Marquette didn't spell it out in his report that the Mississippi River had rapids there, we see on his map that they do. And this is the source for that, from Michael's article. And what's also cool is that, see, the Army Corps of Engineers on a lot of these major rivers like the Illinois River and the Mississippi River, they built dams at the rapid sites. Where there were rapids, that's where the dams went. And these two circles here correspond with locking dams 18 and 19 on the Mississippi. Approaching today's St. Louis, they saw logs, whole trees, even floating islands, and a muddy torrent pouring out into the Mississippi from the Missouri River. Marquette referred to the Missouri River as the river meaning it flows muddy. A good name for it. Continuing farther south, one of Joliet's objectives was to determine whether the Mississippi and the Ohio were the same river. Okay, we heard that the French heard that the Iroquois speakers talk about this great river that leads to the sea called the Ohio, but then we know that the Algonquian speakers from Great Lakes country call a big river, Mississippi or the Mississippi, which also leads to a good river, leads to the sea. So the question is the Mississippi the same as the Ohio, just two different names from two different language group, or are they two different rivers? That was one of Joliet's objectives. Another one was to find out into which sea this river, whatever it is, dumps into. Sea of the South, meaning Gulf of Mexico. Was it Sea of California, or was it somewhere by today's state of Virginia? And they found out that these are two separate rivers. The party arrived at the mouth of this river, the name that Marquette applied to today's Ohio River. In fact, the pre-1673 Miami, Illinois language name for the Ohio is this, which means Cawpaw River. Okay. Now, this was from Michael McCafferty as well. Onomastics substantiates the connection between the Cawpaw, Omaha, these same groups here, and others, because the Miami, Illinois name for the river, for the Ohio River, is this, which means Cawpaw River. In fact, the cognate Shawnee name translates to Caw River. But the interesting thing is, at the time Marquette mentions these names, these tribes didn't live anywhere near the Ohio River. They lived in Arkansas and down that way, closer to Oklahoma, today's Oklahoma, maybe even northern Texas and that. So what that shows is these people did live there at one time, and that name was retained from them when they once lived there, even though they no longer live there anymore. So it's kind of a cool way to be able to trace the movements of these tribes before the advent of the Europeans. And we can see they use a lot of those Greek letters A right there. And there's the Mansopelea right here, right south of them. What's also cool is Marquette's features the lower Illinois River. He did a pretty good job because the Illinois River looks mostly like this, okay? Jolliet, the Joliet Franklin map, this is 1674 version, and this one here is 1675 version, have it going like this. And even for the next century, the Hutchins 1771 map still has it following Joliet's template, okay? Marquette's map was extremely accurate given the circumstances. It was so accurate that some people like Steck, who said that Marquette's map is a fraud, it's a fake, and it was a conspiracy by the Jesuits to defraud the Franciscans out of their shared nonsense like that. And that has been picked up by at least one individual nowadays, but Marquette knew how to draw maps, okay? There's a reason, however, for why that Joliet Franklin map, one of them that I just showed you, was used as a template for later maps. And this goes back into 1673 map was in Quebec until 1773. Okay, it was being held by the Jesuits. But in 1773, the Jesuits were banished from Quebec. Okay, it was at that time when the nuns took that map and hid it. Okay, and when the Jesuits were allowed to return to Canada in 1842, they gave it back to them, and the Jesuits were no doubt surprised, which is pretty cool. Let's have a couple of issues, and these are questions I've had about this voyage, and that's why I usually use the Socratic method for this. Issues, the map, all right, the report / map that was sent with Joliet from Marquette was lost in a canoe wreck somewhere right around here in the rapids, the Lachine Rapids, right north of just a short distance upstream from Montreal in July 1674. This is why Joliet met with Dablon. Okay, it wasn't like, hey, how you doing? Good to see you. How you been? You know, how's the kids? It wasn't because of that. It was because Joliet lost Marquette's stuff in that canoe wreck, and he gave Dablon a verbal account of what they saw. Okay, and we know that this map, Marquette's new map, who he kept a copy of it, smarter than the average bear, kept a copy of it in Wisconsin, and that map made it to Quebec in May of 1675. But this raises the question, was the map that Joliet lost exact duplicate of the one that Marquette had, or were they different? Was one a little bit rougher? And Marquette had 13 months while he was recovering from an illness at St. Xavier's. Did he write a bunch of things down there that wasn't on the first map? That we'll never know, but it's kind of cool to think about it, I think. Did Marquette draw that map while he was in the canoe as they were going up and down the rivers in Lake Michigan? That's another question. We'll never really know that, I guess. Or did he draw it at St. Xavier's Mission? And if he did that, well, then Joliet and the crew had to hang around for a couple of days while Marquette was doing it. Once again, we'll probably never have any definite answers like this, but it's kind of interesting to speculate whether or not the map that made it to Quebec was the exact same one that Marquette was keeping at St. Xavier's. Then there's the issue of the mysterious Peoria village. If you read the very last part of Marquette's report, he talks about they passed through the Illinois of Peoria, where he spent 3 days preaching the faith in all the cabins, and he baptized a dying child or infant just before it died. And it goes, if it wasn't for all the hardships of the voyage, just for that one act, made all the hardships worthwhile. The problem of that is this: number one, where was this village? Marquette didn't mention anything on his map about this particular Peoria village. He doesn't mention that he stayed anywhere for 3 days, and he doesn't mention, anywhere in the narrative. This is the last sentences of his report. So what it appears is that this is another one of them things that the blonde probably stuck on at the end of that to maybe add a little bit of, because this thing is going to his supervisor and then his supervisor in France, and then it's going to end up in Italy, in Rome. And so he may have done this for effect or something like that, but it sticks out. You're reading things and all of a sudden, where did that come from? And this is a classic example of that. So my own personal opinion, my opinion in 250, you'll get your soda out of the machine down the hall. I think this is, the blonde stuck this in here too. Okay. And this is one of the things, there are some really, really fantastic Jesuit historians, Raphael Hamilton, Joseph Donnelly. But one of the issues that I had with them, and one of the reasons why I wrote this book, is because when a Jesuit superior writes something, the people after them, the other Jesuits, never contest it. They will try to make it fit, try to make it work. And I give a couple examples in my book about Joliet and Marquette meeting and things, and some of the unlikely scenarios that have been put forth. This is a map, the 1681 map drawn by Thevenot. They call it, this is one of the Manitoumi maps. This is the Mississippi River right here. It was probably drawn by a Jesuit or at the behest of the Jesuits. So in order to make that Peoria village fit, he has them going all the way back to that Peoria village that they had already visited up in the Des Moines River, and then crossing 100 and some miles overland, carrying 2 canoes, boxes of goods, guns, trade goods, and everything else through tall grass prairies, swamps, and forests to get to Kaskaskia right here. Well, we know that didn't happen. Okay, how do we know it? Because Marquette wrote about, he drew the map of the lower Illinois River. He explained how the current was. So this is one of those examples where I just wish they would have just said, well, maybe the blonde added that and went on. Okay. The Indian boy that I mentioned earlier. So what's the significance? Well, we know it according to Lepatre, that who claimed to have spoken personally with Joliet. Joliet told him that that slave boy brought him back by the shorter route, the Illinois River route, which is about 200 leagues shorter. Okay, and had them enter he meant not St. Joseph River, that's in Michigan, but the Illinois River. The boy was a guide because, as I mentioned earlier, there's all kinds of rivers that dump into the Mississippi. How do you know this one was the Illinois? What if you were on this side of the island instead of that side of the island? You might have missed a river altogether. And remember, I mentioned too that these Kaskaskias and Peorias and all the different Illinois groups, they had constant communication with each other. Okay, so the boy had probably been to Kaskaskia a number of times and was a guide. In fact, the Illinois River at this time still is actually to this day, parts of it was nothing but, it was a mile wide in some places and full of islands with lakes on islands and dead ends and sloughs and channels and swamps and things like that. It was just a virtual maze trying to find that main channel without getting lost. People like Henri Joutel in 1687 and Henry Schoolcraft found themselves completely lost in some of these backwater bays, and it took them quite a while to extricate themselves. Okay, this is one of the tiny little spots. To give you some example, this is Emaquan, about 40 miles south of 30 miles south of Peoria, and that's being this was all drained in the early 1900s. Now the Nature Conservancy, federal government, and state government in Illinois are trying to buy all this land and restore it to what it once was. And you can see there's rivers here and islands here, there's channels here, and just all kinds of stuff. This is what it looks like now. And this is just a tiny little portion of what it would have looked like in 1673. Another issue is someone brought to my attention that it had the water must have been high. Illinois River must have been at high water as they ascended the river because Marquette didn't know anything about rapids on the Illinois and Des Plaines River. Well, I don't think that's the case at all. Matter of fact, Marquette illustrated rapids on the Mississippi River, and he mentioned some of them on the Fox River. We know there were rapids on the Illinois and Des Plaines River. Those were solid rapids almost at one point, especially during the summer. We know too that he didn't mention other rapids, at the Grand Concolin Rapids in Wisconsin or the Petite or Grand Colomie Rapids. So he mentioned some, didn't mention other ones, okay? And neither did the two Frankel and Jolliet maps, okay? Now we know this is right in front of Starved Rock State Park, right about a mile downstream from the Kaskaskia village. We look at a 1680 or an 1883 map, Army Corps of Engineer map, and this is before the diversion of the Chicago River, which is double the size of the Illinois River, plus the lock and dam system. You can see rapids, 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 rock. These zigzag lines here are all depths. So if you were to zoom this in, you'll be able to see that this river was only a foot deep or 6 inches deep or so here. So we know those rapids were there in the river at that time. However, Marquette, and there may be another reason about this that we'll get to in a second, Marquette did write that Kaskaskia was located at a portage. This is the site of the giant Kaskaskia village. Starved Rock, see the shoreline there on the other side of the river. Starved Rock would be behind that building right there, okay? Why did they live there? First of all, for safety, because you have a shallow river with rapids in front of you that no one's going to cross to get you, and behind you you have sheer cliffs, so it's in a safe spot. But probably more importantly is because there's aerated water there, something that people for thousands of years knew, that if we build a village here where there's not good water, we're going to die, okay? And in fact, if you look at the history of the city of Chicago, they didn't even learn this until the late 1800s. That's why they reversed the flow of the Chicago River into the Illinois River, because they were putting all their sewage and industrial waste into the Chicago River, which flowed out into Lake Michigan, which they were drinking. So there was a couple good reasons for settling there, plus the bison herds as well. In fact, LaSalle wrote that Starved Rock, his fort on Starved Rock, was located, quote, at the portage on the Illinois River. Marquette mentioned the rapids at the St. Xavier Mission, and he shows that the Illinois River, and this is what's really cool, and this might have been one reason why he shows that the didn't put the rapids on the Illinois River, because the Illinois River was a much smaller stream than the Mississippi River, okay? And the rapids on the Illinois River are on the upper part of it, the far upper part of the Illinois River, not below where the places where all the swamps and islands are, okay? The Illinois River is actually two rivers and not one. We look here, look how big the Mississippi River is, look how big the Illinois River is, until you get right about there around Peoria, and we can see this little narrow line right there. There's probably one reason why he didn't put dots or slashes. Another explanation, and I think this is probably the best. Few explorers and missionaries ever wrote about rapids because they're just simply a part of travel. Okay, so you're going to write a book about the day you got fired by your boss or the day you saw some big event. Would you write in your book that you got stopped at 14 stoplights on the way there and then you got caught by 2 trains? No, it's just part of travel, okay? You're going to write about what happened. That's probably the same thing. Besides, we knew that DeBlanc wrote that there was 40 sets of rapids between Sault Ste. Marie and Montreal. Very few people, explorers, really mentioned these things, okay? And the bottom line is because Marquette didn't mention rapids doesn't mean there were any. Now, was it, was the Illinois River flooded in 1673 and the rapids were underwater? No, because Marquette wrote, the Illinois River shortens our route and takes us, but with little effort, to the lake of the Illinois. The Illinois was flooded. I worked for 25 years in boats, all different kinds of boats, patrol boats and John boats and everything out on that river all the way from Grafton, Illinois to darn near Jolliet. And let me tell you, if the river is flooded, you knew it. It would have taken much effort, okay? There's nothing mentioned about strong currents, flooded timber, debris, or anything like that, okay? Marquette did mention those things, as we have saw on the Mississippi. Bottom line, it's because Marquette didn't mention rapids, doesn't mean the Illinois River was flooded. To this, though, we can never have metaphysical certitude. It's a matter of evidence and probabilities. For example, right here, this is the Marseilles Rapids on the upper Illinois River. How do we know those were there? Because for one reason or another, people like Tonti in 1680 mentioned them. LaSalle wrote about them in a complaint letter. Jotel wrote about him in 1688. Matter of fact, he said this was the roughest set of rapids that he encountered from Texas all the way to Quebec. Okay. Charlevoix in 1721 mentioned them. Delisle, 1722. The Brit Kennedy mentioned in 1773. Hugh Howard's in 1790. Henry Schoolcraft in 1821. And Armstrong's American U.S. Army cartographers in June of 1990 wrote about these rapids or mentioned them. Okay, so we know they were there. But here, having worked for the Illinois Department of Natural Resources for many years, for decades, and still being associated with them at Starved Rock State Park, so a total of about 40 years, there's the typical standard way the Illinois River flows. Rain in the spring, drought in the summer. You can take a look here at 1879. The Illinois River was almost dry. And it was like that in the summer of 1680 when Tonti was at the Kaskaskia village, heard a rumor that LaSalle was dead and tried to get back up north by canoe, but he couldn't even traverse the Illinois River because it had almost no water in it, and he had to come back to Kaskaskia. So you see the repeating cycle: rain, spring, summer, like that. This one here goes all the way to 1899. Basically the same kind of summer. So was it flooded? If we just go by probabilities, it's probably not. But then, was Marquette sick? Could it possibly be he didn't write about rapids because he wasn't feeling well? I think this is a very big issue, that he might have been sick during the last legs of the voyage. In fact, Marquette wrote very little about the Illinois Valley or Kaskaskia. It's the people he came to teach, and convert. It's where he came back when he was dying 2 years later to meet these Indians, to hold the first mass in today's state of Illinois, and found the first Catholic mission in today's Illinois. But he mentions virtually nothing about it, okay? Matter of fact, when you look at the map, you'll see the Des Plaines River and the Portage, Chicago Portage, they're not on the map either, okay? There's only about 10 sentences from the Arkansas village all the way down to the Arkansas River to when they land at Green Bay, okay? That whole distances. Marquette wrote all kinds of stuff about wild rice, or DeBlanc probably did it and added in there. He wrote about different types of pipes, different kinds of dances, different types of this, different types of that. But this whole way, this 1,500 mile trek, he writes 10 sentences. So that's kind of suspicious to me, okay? And even de Blonde wrote, the great hardships of his first voyage had brought upon Marquette a bloody flux, and he was giving hope of undertaking a second mission. He spent 13 months recuperating at the St. Xavier mission. It's possible, too, that Marquette didn't mention much about the Illinois River because, at Rapids, because he was very, very sick at the time. And that seems to make more sense. So in summary, these have been a few observations about mine and about Marquette's 1673 of his map, his and Joliet's voyage. Some maps, some places, some features, and some issues. And as the Miami and Illinois would have said 300 years ago, nay way. I thank you.
So Lorraine would like to know, since the water levels of the rivers can vary from year to year, is it possible that the rapids weren't significant at the time of Marquette's travel?
No, they would have been there. As a matter of fact, all the later, those people that I mentioned, but the last, and those are just a few, they, dating all the way from Henri Jotel, and he spent the winter at LaSalle's fort at Starved Rock in 1687, 1688. From that point on, they start talking about just how difficult, not so much the Starved Rock rapids are, but the Marseilles rapids. You have Delisle in 1722. He was looking for copper, an expedition, probably hearing what LaSalle wrote, that there's pieces of copper in the Illinois country. They had to ditch their canoes way back a couple of miles from Starved Rock, 4 miles or so from Starved Rock. Henry Schoolcraft, 1821, he was working for the U.S. government with Lewis Cass, a name you folks probably know very well. They couldn't get up the Illinois River at all. And this is in August. This is about the same time Marquette and Joliet were going through there. And so they had to hike to Starved Rock and find somebody to get them horses, because they were going to Chicago from St. Louis to negotiate a Potawatomi Treaty in Lower Michigan. And so it's just report after report after report after report of people who were in that area at the time. Things come to a screeching halt as far as river transportation goes during the summer months.
Well, thank you. We have Michael McCafferty here today with us as well, and he'd like to know, how do we know that the 6,000 people at the Peoria village on the Des Moines River in 1673 weren't Peorias?
Well, just because of the sheer numbers of Peorias. Citing a really good study on the population of the Illinois is by Joseph Zitemersky. And I mean, he goes into minute detail. And according to him, what the best numbers that they can figure is in 1677, which would have been a couple of years after that, his best estimates are there were total about 9,600 Illinois total. And that's not including the Michigamia. So 6,000 Peorias alone, that just seems like a big number, because we looked at the Kaskaskia and there's only 1,500 of them. Peoria was definitely the largest tribe, and there's throughout that period history there were 2 groups of them, but I just don't see there being 6,000 Peorias and then 3,000 of the other 11 or so sub tribes. But that's like I say, my opinion, and $2.50 will get you soda.
Well, thank you again. We have a lot of thank yous. We have a question from Mark Freilich. Did Marquette report on his trip through Lake Huron, passing Sheboygan, Michigan, Mackinac Island, and the straits between Lake Huron and Michigan?
No, this voyage would have just took them from St. Ignace just right along the coast right there. He does mention an earlier 1671 when him and Alleyways were at the La Pointe mission by Ashland, Wisconsin. That was a series of winter villages, about 10 or 12 tribes right there. And in springtime, they'd split. The Meskwaki would go south, and the Adawa and the different Anishinaabe groups would go to Sault Ste. Marie to fish in that. But in 1671, that village, those villages basically came to an end. They were abandoned because of warfare with the Sioux, of which Marquette called the Iroquois of the West. And Marquette talks about a bit about, well, these people went this way. He doesn't mention anything in particular, but we do know through him and other missionaries at the time, like Eliways, that they went to a lot of these Wendat and Anishinaabe groups went to Manitoulin Island, and Marquette followed the main group of Wendat and Adawas to Mackinac, or not to St. Ignace, not Mackinac Island. So he mentioned them kind of in passing, kind of that not being the focus or anything. It's kind of like we were running for our, I'm paraphrasing here. We're running for safety, and we went here and they went there, and kind of that's about it. No great detail on any of it. But we know that from the later missionaries, though, that they were dealing with those groups at those places, if that helps.
Well, thank you. Let's see, there's another question. Craig Moiser, did Marquette ETL land at or near the Toolsboro Mound in Iowa? Local history there says yes. Are you familiar with that?
Yeah, I don't. If it's south of the Wisconsin River, they would have passed it, because there's all kinds of Mississippian period mounds. They're like not Sleeping Bears, up by Pikes Peak. They're across from the mouth. It's a national historic spot. There's mound groups all up and down both rivers, from southern Minnesota all the way to darn near New Orleans, through Arkansas and places. So they would have passed it. But the thing is, when you're dealing with a lot of these historical figures, I live here in Illinois, and the two main historical figures that have been everywhere, done everything, and their grandfathers knew them personally, is Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln was everywhere in Illinois. Okay. And then Al Capone. Al Capone had a hideout here. Al Capone, yeah, my grandfather knew Al Capone. Yeah, my grandfather used to pump gas for him. Al Capone gave him $5 bill. So it's kind of like, unless I see something specific, I will withhold my affirmative opinion, if that helps. I'm sure he went past the place, but whether or not he visited there, I don't see any I have never found any written evidence for that, but somebody can present it, I'm all eyes and ears.
Thank you. And we have one last question from David Trudeau. Do you know anything about LaSalle's 1660s exploration in Ohio? Yeah,
what we do know is we know virtually nothing of what he did. It's unfortunate. He was trying to get to the Ohio, but before they got there, see, he was in a group with a couple of missionaries. It was Gallinet and it happens when you get older. Gallinet and the other guy. That LaSalle was planning to go there, but they couldn't go unless they brought the missionaries with him. And LaSalle was doing some actually really crazy behavior. He went into some kind of fever for about 3 days, and some of the people in the expeditions thought he saw a rattlesnake or something like that. And LaSalle was a very temperamental, kind of strange kind of guy. And at the point where the two groups split, because Jolliet and Gallinet were the two. They kept the journal of that voyage. Okay, and when those two split, then it's kind of like that's all we know. A lot of supporters of LaSalle, Francis Parkman, Paul Chesno, and a couple of other ones who, and some of them that even say that LaSalle was on the Mississippi River, someplace in Mississippi where they found a stone. I can't remember the name of it, something like a Kensington stone or something like that, that some farmer found. We have no direct evidence of it, and I really, really doubt that he did. My opinion, of course, but unless I can find something somewhere other than somebody 100 years later writing that he did find and explore the Mississippi, I'm going to have to take the negative position.
Thank you again, Mark. I'd like to end our presentation today and thank all of you, and Mark especially, for a fantastic presentation.
Well, thank you.
You all for joining us. With that, I wish to say thank you again, and then please enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you so much. Have a wonderful day, everyone.
Thank you.